Salve omnes! Today we're going to be doing Acroasis IV, which is from Chapter 1, pages 1 through 4 of Wheelock. We're going to be talking about the present active indicative and the present active infinitive today. So let's start with the first step. We're going to discite, or learn. Latin is an inflected language. This means that the endings change on words to denote different functions, essentially who's doing an action or if something's the subject and things like that. Now, we're going to be talking exclusively about verbs today, which is an action, of course, or a state of being, as you remember from our discussion on the imperative. Verbs in Latin have 4 base forms. These are called principal parts. And principal parts are used to make the verbs in different tenses, voices, moods, persons, and numbers. And we'll go into what those terms actually mean in a little bit. So let's take a look at an example at the bottom here at the screen. You see amo, amare, amavi, amatum, to love. So here you can see the 4 different principal parts, and they're very creatively named. First principal part, second principal part, third principal part, and fourth principal part. Now take a look at our little graphic here. This is just to show you that many other languages are also inflected to some degree. So this is not something that is unique to Latin. In fact, it's used in quite a few other languages, including English. So Latin is, however, just a little bit more inflected than English is, but even so, you can see that English does have quite a bit of inflection. If you take a look at this little paragraph underneath our picture that has blue and red text, the blue text are English inflections, and this is just to give you an idea of how we inflect in English. Not quite as intense as with Latin, but we do have inflection, so this is not something that's different or unique to Latin. So nota bene, or NB as we abbreviate in English, Latin is a highly inflected language, means that the endings are extremely important. In fact, you might want to read words backwards rather than forwards. So essentially start at the end of the word before you go to the front of the word. I know in English we're trained to look at the front and we don't pay as much attention to the end, but in Latin we have to kind of do the opposite. So let's take a look at what these terms that we were talking about earlier mean. So person, who is the subject? First person, second person, and third person are our options when we talk about person. First is I and we, second you and you all, third he, she, it, and they. Now you've probably heard these used in English class a lot when they ask you to write in a specific person. So if you're ever confused on that point, this is what they're talking about. So number refers to how many of those persons we're talking about. If it's singular, we're talking about I, you, he, she, or it, one person, essentially. If it's plural, we're talking about more than one when we use the words we, you, all, and they. Tense is when the verb is taking place, present, past, and future in English. Voice is talking about who is performing the verb. Now that is different from who is the subject. So when it's active, the subject is doing the action. But when it's passive, an object is technically performing the action on the subject. It's kind of weird, but we don't use passive as much in English. But we'll get into that much later, so don't worry about it for right now. Mood is the verb really happening? So this is the indicative, which is factual, definite. I go to the store. There's no question whether or not I've gone, I go. The imperative is when you command someone, go to the store. Difference there. The subjunctive is your opinion or indefinite, or I might go to the store. It's not sure. We're not quite certain if we're going to the store yet. So that's the difference between those 3. We're going to be focusing on the indicative today, and last video you focused on the imperative. So let's take a look a little bit more about verbs. Now to change endings on verbs, we conjugate them. You're going to hear this term a lot, so it's important to remember. Now a conjugation of a verb tells you what pattern is used to conjugate them. Lots of conjugating in this. A conjugation is determined by the ending of the second principal part of a verb. So take a look at amo again, and you can see amare right there is the second principal part, and it ends in are. Now that are tells us that it is first conjugation. So the 2 we're focusing on right now are first, which are the ones that end in are, and second, the ones that end in long re. That little line over the e just means it's long. So now let's take a look at these personal endings, and these are the endings that essentially denote who is doing the action, the person in the number. So if a verb ends in O, it's I. If it ends in S, you or thou, for those of us who are very formal. If it ends in T, it's going to be he, she, or it. MUS, we. TIS, you all, and NT, they. So you notice that for the plural endings, some of them still end in S and T, which are also you see in your singular. So that means you're going to have to look not just at the very last letter, but probably a few letters back just to make sure you're not looking at a first plural or a third plural ending. Okay? So just make sure you double check the whole ending and not just the last letter. So now let's look at some examples. The first, I run, kuro. Now notice how both the O and the I are highlighted in purple. That is because they correlate to each other. So the O here essentially stands for I in English at the end of the verb. Now let's take a look at another one. We run, kurimos. Again, notice that we have the MUS with we. So now let's take a look at this one. He runs, kurit. Notice the T, and it's a he. They run, kurant. Now notice this one ends in NT, so therefore your pronoun is going to be they. So again, these words are backwards of what we would do in English, which doesn't mean necessarily that that's weird, it's just different than what we've done. And remember, most languages actually do this. Now let's take a look at an example. Now here you can see laudo, laudas, laudat, laudamus, laudatus, laudant. All of the endings are highlighted in red with the correlating subjects highlighted in red with the translation options below. Now these are three different options. The most convenient or the most frequently used is the first one, I praise, which we would call a simple present. I am praising would be the present continuous, and I do praise would be the present emphatic. And you would just switch between these depending on what you were trying to convey precisely, but these are the three ways that we translate present tense in English and how it's used in Latin. Now let's take a look at some formation. How do we make this? So let's take a look at how we form it. The first step is to use the first principal part. That first principal part literally equals first person singular. Cogito is I think. So, and we would say id est, i.e., means that is the same thing. But when we get to the rest of them, how do we make the rest of them? That's when we get to step 2. So step 2, for all other forms, you're going to use the second principal part of the verb and take off the RE. So after we finish with I, for you, he, she, it, we, you all, and they, we're going to use the second principal part, the one that ends in RE. So look at the second form. We're going to take off the RE, and then we're left with cogita. And then after that, we'll add the personal endings, ST, MUS, TIS, or NT, depending on who we want to do the subject. Now, it's important to remember that cogita is also called the present stem. So you will sometimes hear us use present stem to talk about cogita, which is the stem of the second principal part after you take off that RE. So now take a look again at this example. You can see laudo highlighted in blue is the exact same form that you see with the first person singular. And for all the rest, laudas, 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 laudat, laudamus, laudatus, laudant, you can see that laudare is the stem that we get those from. Take off the RE and you're left with lauda, and that's how we get the vowel that comes before the consonant endings. Now let's take a look at a different use of the second principal part. Now, the second principal part is also called the infinitive. Now, this is why this principal part is super important in Latin, is because it is used for so many different things. The infinitive is also given as your default translation for each verb in the dictionary. So whenever you see a word in a dictionary, you're going to see it all the way through, and then the end will be to whatever the verb means. So when you look at amo, amare, amavi, amatus, to love, amare literally means to love by itself when we don't take anything off. So that's what an infinitive is. It's to verb. And we use these a lot in English, like I like to run, I want to eat. Infinitives are typically a supporting verbal form. That means it's just used with a verb. So for example, debeo studere, I ought to study. So let's take a look at some exercitaciones. So take a look at all these. I've highlighted in green what I would like you to fill in the blank with in Latin. So take a minute, pause the video, fill these in, and if you need to, you can rewind the video and look back at the examples and see if that helps you. You will need to use your vocabulary list in Wheelock to make sure that you have the right forms of the verbs. And when you're done, resume the video and we'll go over your work. Okay, so now let's take a look at the answers to these. So for number 1, nihil servare blank, we want to say we ought to save nothing. So when we say we ought, we're going to use debemus. Now, number 2, necesse est blank me, it is necessary to advise me. Now we're using the infinitive form. So we would use munere. Next, we have me non blank. They are not calling me. Now, non, it means not. And remember, they are calling is just another way of translating present tense. So we just want to say they call, if that confused you for a minute. So wokant would be the correct answer. And if you couldn't understand what I was saying, here's the answers in written form. Okay, that is all for today. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Valete omnes, don't forget to fill out your Google Forms, and I'll see you next time.